Fandom began in the 1930s with Hugo Gernsback's magazine called Science Wonder Stories. Fans could send letters to this magazine, and the letters would be published in the next issue. Thus began fan communication with each other. Shortly after, the first science fiction fanzine, called The Comet, was published. Fanzines are amateur magazines published by dedicated fans to promote discussion about the topics covered in the issue. Fans could now send their letters to the fanzines as an additional form of communication. In 1939, the first science fiction convention was held in New York City. The name of this was World Science Fiction Convention, and it was held in conjunction with the 1939 New York World's Fair. At this convention, science fiction authors gave talks about their novels. The fans attended these lectures and could also socialize with one another in person. In the years that would follow, letter columns began to appear in science fiction magazines and in comic books. Then suddenly, fanzines became published for comics, fantasy, and even pulp fiction. This caused for a larger fan nation spread across America and eventually the world. Soon people joined clubs related to any of these various topics. Finally, in the 1990s, with the beginning of the internet and computer popularity, message boards, news groups, and websites on these topics began. This saw an end to fanzines and a new way of communication for fans. Now, in recent years, fans have begun recording podcasts and YouTube webisodes to discuss their favorite topics and then broadcast it on the internet.
There are many factors that inspire the interest of any person. However, for most fans, there are a small number of defining moments that first cause their journey into fandom. Another main reason why people begin to show interest in any of these various topics is because of a friend or relative who highly enjoys fantasy, science fiction, or comic books. This friend or relative is probably very close to the fan that they are impacting, or the ideas would not become as strong in the mind of the young fan. Of course, as I said before, a person does not have to know another fan. But if they do not, what is it that inspires any random person to become a fan? I don't think that anyone but the fans themselves can answer this question, so let's ask them.
I mean, as far as science fiction goes, I've been a fan of science fiction and fantasy since I was younger than you, probably. What made me graduate to that from the comics was probably Tolkien. That was one of my best stories that I've read and still reread every year.
So what made you decide to open a store and be in the business of comics?
Of comics? Well, exactly that. I was a big fanboy. I've enjoyed being on the collecting end, which I still am. But what made me get into the business of it was basically I was dissatisfied with what was out there for the fanboy. You know, you would go to the comic book shop and that's basically all they had was, you know, little comics. And that's it. None of the paraphernalia that you can get into and delve into and get lost.
Well, for me personally, there are two things that really attract me to these topics. And one of those is that a very important idea in much of this media is the idea of transformation. And I think it's a really powerful topic, and it really draws me in. The idea of, if you take Star Wars, for example, Luke Skywalker is a farm boy. And, you know, throughout the course of the movie, he becomes a great hero. Or if you take the idea of Han, who's a good guy, but a not so good guy. But through the power of his friendships, he transforms himself into somebody who is really a force for good in the world. You take a look at comic books. Of course, comics apply these ideas all the time. The idea that Peter Parker, who's a geeky high school student, gets bitten by a radioactive spider and is suddenly a superhero, and decides to use his powers for the good of everyone. For example, Lord of the Rings, Frodo, as they say in the movie, the least powerful, most, unassuming character in all the world, ends up being really the savior of the world. So
when I was growing up, I would say from about age 5 up until the week, 2 weeks before I got married, because I still lived at home before I got married because there was no reason to leave. Free food, rent, think about that, we'll talk. But we used to get our books, and it would be Tuesday, Wednesday, and Thursday nights. We would sit, I would either be on the floor or on my bed, my dad would be on the other side of the bed or on the floor or in a beanbag chair, and we would just be reading comics together and handing them to each other. And my dad would be reading something going, oh, you're not going to believe this, and then not give it to me for like 20 minutes. And it was a lot of stuff like that. I mean, those are the things that when I think about my childhood and think about just the great relationship that I have with my dad, it was mostly because of comics. So the best part, and you'll find this out someday soon, when you have kids, you get to do the same thing to them, because my daughters, they go to the stores with me, they know all the characters, they absolutely love to read comics. And what's fun for them is they get to meet all the creators as well, and they know everybody, and everybody knows them. But it was just a great tradition. It's something that I absolutely cherish. To me, it's like with my dad taking me out to play sports. My dad was the most important person in my life, still is. And
what first inspired you to become a fan?
When I was younger, probably in my early teens, I started being a heavy reader. I read a lot. I liked mysteries, and I also liked fantasies, and science fiction was a big part of my reading. I really enjoyed Robert Heinlein. I read almost all of his books in the 1970s, and that really got me interested. As media became more available, television, movies, I became more interested in more contemporary types of fantasy, that being comic books. So I started reading more comic books. I liked the storyline. I enjoyed the fact that it was a dual kind of medium, because there was pictures and there was also story. So rather than just reading it, it was more like an experience.
They're good people. They believe in something. They believe in a better tomorrow. They believe that the future is not going to end up in a big mushroom cloud or some disease or alien invasion. That in the words of Gene Roddenberry, that people are strong and intelligent and can do anything, and I follow that belief, and that's what most of the friends of mine that are in this club believe also.
The other thing that I think really appeals to myself, and I think it appeals to lots of fans, is the idea of world building. This idea that there are these other worlds, I mean, not real, obviously, that there are these fantasy worlds that have been created, and these fantasy worlds have a lot of detail to them. And people, myself and others, really enjoy learning about the details of the world and watching the world evolve and change. And people take, or I take, a certain pleasure in knowing about these worlds, being fluent in these worlds and what they're like. So for example, you could take DC Comics or Marvel Comics, they have 50 or 70 years of history, and tons of changes have happened over the course of that history. Thousands of characters populate the worlds, hundreds of events, and I enjoy learning about those characters, their histories, and the events that occurred. The same thing in Lord of the Rings. The detailed background that J.R.R. Tolkien put into the Lord of the Rings creates a really full, three-dimensional world, that has layers upon layers that you can dig into. He has histories written out for thousands and thousands of years, going back to the beginning of time. The same thing, of course, Star Trek. There's literally hundreds of episodes of Star Trek with, thousands of aliens and a great tapestry of history of the future as it is laid out by the various series. And so I think that idea of these other worlds that you can learn about is fascinating.